Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast, where we dive into how emerging technologies will impact the world and your bank account. I'm futurist Thomas Fry, and tonight I'll bring you a solo episode. My co-host Trent Fowler and I are futurists, keynote speakers, and consultants with decades of experience in analyzing trends and communicating new developments to audiences all around the world. Reach out to us on the contact link at futuratipodcast.com if you want to hire us or talk to us about consulting or to speak at your event or to advertise on our podcast. Tonight's episode was with Nicholas Smart, and he is easily one of the brightest people about doing forensics on blockchains. And we got into quite a philosophical discussion about what the merits are and what the challenges are for doing something like this, and how this changes the game of war, and how this will change kind of the financial system moving forward. I found it to be absolutely fascinating. So tonight we're joined by Nicholas Smart. Nick has 15 years experience as a professional intelligence and security analyst, working for government agencies and private companies covering political, social, military, economic, information, and infrastructure issues. And he has experience working as a compliance officer for a cryptoasset trading desk. At present, he is the director of blockchain intelligence and security at Crystal Blockchain Analytics. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Thank you very much. Nicholas, thanks for coming on our show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about kind of the blockchain forensics work that you do and how it's applied and what we can learn from that.
So I work for a company called Crystal Blockchain. I'm the director of data and intelligence. What we mean by blockchain forensics is using the public ledgers available on blockchain to try and piece together a story about a sequence of transactions. The way I kind of look at it is, if you look at like a normal balance sheet of an account, it's like a still photograph where you have, the transactions in and out, but it's not the full history. Whereas with us, it's more like a moving image or like a recording where you can see, perhaps the history of where a transaction started from, who it's interacted with along the way, like what the chain of events that have happened before, funds on the blockchain have arrived at a particular destination. And that's quite an exciting, field to work in, to have such a rich understanding of what's going on with a payment or a particular sort of transaction.
So tell us a little bit about who your customers are and who hires you to do this work.
Okay, so we have a variety of customers. Sometimes it's private investigators, law firms, it can be law enforcement, it could be financial service providers who are looking to protect their companies from financial abuse or financial crime. I think there's lots of opportunities with blockchain analytics generally to improve the transparency of a financial system, because there's now context behind the transaction, like where it's come from, which you may not have had such detail before in traditional financial situations. So it's quite powerful in that regard, and we help our clients to understand what risks they present, but also, in some cases, like where money that's been taken has gone, and maybe if there's an opportunity to try and discover who was behind it, where before that might have been anonymous.
So do you have any particular success story you can kind of step us through and tell us how how you came through victorious and finding that person?
Um, I guess it's not just about finding people. I think it's usually about discovering, um, like the full story. A good case I'll use. There's a chap called Murat Tambiev. Tambiev was a Russian police officer who was tasked with dealing with a cybercrime group. And there was a group in Russian origin called Infraud, who specialized in stolen credentials. So, like, credit card details, passports, that kind of thing. That's what their trade was in. And 4 members of the gang were arrested. It was then later discovered that Murat Tambiev had taken a bribe. And on searching of Murat Tambiev's personal laptop, they discovered a folder called Pension. And in the folder called Pension were the private keys to a Bitcoin wallet, which contained 1,032 Bitcoin. And at the time, the price was around $29 million, which is a pretty big amount of money. It later transpired that he'd taken this money as most likely a bribe. It was seized by the Russian authorities and transferred to a Ledger Nano, which is a type of cryptocurrency hardware wallet. So where do we fit into this? Well, the first part of the story is like we wanted to see if we could find the money that Murat Tambiev had as a bribe. So by using a partial hash of the cryptocurrency wallet address that was released in documents by the Russian government, we were able to locate the full amount of money and where it was stored. So that gave us our first clue, which was, okay, we found the 1,032. The next question was, well, can we work out, now we know it's the money that he took, can we see where the money came from? Like, are there any connections on that to, a criminal group or any indications that might trace it back to Infra? And maybe we can get a deeper understanding of them as an organization. So by following the chain of transactions back, we were able to find where the money had sourced from, and we saw that there was some interactions with some pretty well-known, they call them carding marketplaces, where, personal details, the information is traded by criminals, but in exchange for cash. There was a twist in the story, though, which was quite fascinating. So the 4 guys who Tambiev had arrested, through their lawyer, issued a statement and said that, well, we didn't bribe you 1,032. Actually, the full amount, I believe, was 2,716 Bitcoin. So they said, actually, no, we paid you significantly more money. So our question was, all right, can we find any indications of where that money might have happened? So we've got 1,032 payment. Can we find the missing, 1,500 or whatever it was? So through the transaction tracing, we were able to then identify the additional funds, and we were able to follow them from the points of like where we think they probably came into custody of Infraud, and then we were able to follow them forwards to places where they're basically being exchanged for probably other currency right now, where they've been traded by someone else. The final tick in this story, for me at least, is the bribe. So it's a significant amount of money. We're talking like $40 million total. Like, it's a ton of money. The final sort of like twist in the story is that the 4 guys who were held in prison received suspended sentences, pretty light considering they were and I believe they were one of the FBI's most wanted groups of fraud. They were certainly pretty high up on their policing priorities list. So yeah, what we can learn from this is that the bribe was fairly effective, because clearly they got suspended sentences. We're fairly sure that somebody else within the organization of the Russian police may have taken a bribe, and we were able to determine that through just that fragment of information to begin with, and a clue that he'd taken a bribe in the first place.
Okay. Do your company get paid then in a percentage of what you recover, or how does that work?
No, we don't. So we don't, and I think maybe it's something that needs to be sort of like understood is recovery of cryptocurrency assets is a possibility, if they're traced quickly, but it's not a guarantee. And in terms of our companies like profiting from that, we usually just provide the report, which can help you, deal with the law enforcement if they don't have capacity, or with legal proceedings. Or we haven't taken money from, a percentage fee recovery as a way.
So, so you work in all the different cryptocurrencies, not just Bitcoin, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm assuming there's some cryptos that are pretty hard to work with, uh, that you probably don't get very far with. So now when you're working on trying to diagnose what kind of transactions took place, are you looking more for human trafficking? Are you looking for are you looking for bribery? Are you looking for because there's got to be a gazillion transactions every day. So how do you sort through the mess and determine what's worth looking at?
So I guess the way I'd frame it is there's, from my background in intelligence, we have what's called the intelligence cycle. And it's not perfect. And anybody who's an academic in intelligence and security studies will probably have four of the models they want to talk about, but I think it's one of the nicest ones. So whenever you start an intelligence problem, you have to start with direction, which is like the question you're trying to solve. I'm a big fan of like Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And there's this, the idea of like the question is perhaps more important than the answer. I tend to think is significant. So when we look at the blockchain, you're right, there are millions, of transactions happening every single day. It's huge to do. It's like, where do we start in a tracing? What do we look at in terms of what's interesting? And usually there's some catalyst. So there'll be a high profile theft, or someone will, do a fraud of some description, and there'll cryptocurrency be involved. Maybe it'll be, we'll have some kind of trigger that cryptocurrency was involved in a particular activity, and then we try to get in the middle of it and work out like the truth, like what's happened. And what's interesting too is that, there's there's mysteries and secrets. I don't know if that sort of reference goes, but like we have two sort of things in the world. Like we have a mystery and a secret, and a secret is something that we can get an answer to, right? And there'll be a definitive answer. In this case is, was money taken from this wallet, or was this project, did the founders of the project exit early with lots of people's money? Like we can generally get you an answer to that question because it's secret. So it's hidden from us, but we can reveal the truth. Whereas in some cases there's mysteries, which is like, well, why did this happen? Like, why did the founders do this? Like more about motive and things which aren't possibly, we can speculate on, but we're never going to get a full answer to. But what we tend to do is look for like the story that's catalyzing. And we do look at other big things. So like trends in the market. So could it be, looking at illicit marketplaces? So we know that cryptocurrency has found a lot of utility for people who are buying and selling illicit goods and services. So we look at trends in those marketplaces. Your listeners may or may not know, but last year a fairly sizable .NET marketplace called Hydra, which was predominantly Russian language speaking again, was shut down in a joint coordinated effort between a variety of law enforcement partners, which resulted in the servers being seized. A fairly big result. It was a huge drug marketplace. Loads of money was going through it. Lots of, bad people hung out there. It's good that it's been shut down. The issue is that there's been a vacuum since, and in the vacuum, it's now been filled by a number of competing parties who are trying to, take over the market share that was, left by this massive site. And we look at, who's emerging, who's up and coming, and we try and look at trends in these things. And it's kind of interesting because you can see, like almost like the popularity of various things. You can see the rising stars, both in the licit world and also the illicit world, and see how, crime is reacting to law enforcement and what policies have been, what their impact has been on these particular marketplaces. And I'll take those for example. So Hydra was shut down, and the addresses associated, so the cryptocurrency addresses, so basically it's not a common thing, but basically it's like the sending account numbers. So if anyone was to receive funds from these cryptocurrency addresses that had US facing operations, they would seize the funds that came from it, right? That's how it works. And they were listed as sanctioned by the US government. As a policy response to this. Well, what we noted was, although Hydra was shut down, none of the people behind Hydra faced prosecutorial charges. And, very quickly we had the emergence of 4 new marketplaces, which, but it's interesting because you can sort of see like policymakers trying to respond and trying to do something about this. And like the idea is, okay, we can sanction this, maybe we can limit this, but it's a completely different kettle of fish. Like you can't necessarily apply the same logic to it. And it also shows, the cracks in some of these attempts to try and deal with these guys, because although you've shut down the marketplace, it's just reconstituted in 4 other places, and that has, obviously bigger, far-reaching consequences.
Hello, this is Trent Fowler, co-host of the Futurati podcast. One of the most common pieces of marketing advice I've come across is to know your audience and give them what they want. One difficulty in podcasting is that it's actually pretty hard to do this. None of the major platforms give us any way to reach out to you, our listeners, to find out what you enjoy about the Futurati podcast and what you'd like to see done differently. So we've decided to record this commercial and ask you directly to reach out to us. Head over to futuratipodcast.com, go to the contact page, and drop us a line. Tell us about your favorite and least favorite episodes, what you'd like to see us cover in the future, and anything else you want us to know. We produce this show for you, and we want your advice so we can make it even better. Thank you.
So one of the big issues we're dealing with in the U.S. is whether something is a security or whether it's a commodity in the crypto space. Does your software have the ability to go in and do forensics and tell whether it was operating more as a security or more as a commodity?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I asked that as a joke, actually, because
I wish we could get some clarity on it.
Yeah, that's tending to drive a lot of people nuts at the moment here.
Yeah.
But the people that hire you, are they government agencies primarily, or is it corporations, or do you have individuals?
It's a mixture of all of them, to be honest with you. It's a mixture of all of them. And I think it's an interesting one too, is that there have been some the sort of original community around cryptocurrency, like the Bitcoin early days was very much libertarian. The cypherpunks, like the history of this thing was grounded in people who didn't want lots of government involvement, right? They didn't want that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of resentment amongst some of the old guard. I noticed on your podcast you spoke to Peter McCormack. He's certainly not a fan of he does the What Bitcoin Did podcast. He's certainly no fan of tools like ours. And he's had a few interactions with some of the other providers in the past and been quite, pointed about, your invasion of my privacy. Your tools can be used to suppress, public discourse or, abuse people's rights. And I kind of get the logic behind it, and where this comes from, though the sad reality is that for this product to be viable, for cryptocurrency to exist, we need a level of controls around it to keep, those who are abusing it out of the system, right? And, we can certainly point to the traditional financial system and say, how their controls evolved since, the Bank Secrecy Act in the 1970s through to how they are today. This has all been done in order to try and control, illicit use of the financial system. And like, if we want it to be a viable product, then we need to think about how we do better, rather than say, well, we don't want this, we need to do better than they do. And I think that's important for building trust. And like, I think a lot of the issues that circulate around tools like ours, and there are lots of different camps about it, but certainly one of the bigger issues that floats around these tools is, well, I want to buy substances that my government considers illegal, right? Because I feel like I don't think that that particular law should apply to my lifestyle, whatever else, that's that. Right. I mean, also that's a policy thing in terms of the government. Like, we don't set drug policy, we don't have any impact on that bearing. But also at the same time, you've got to understand that, well, if you want this currency to be worth something, and people want to sort of like invest their pension funds in cryptocurrency, you need to have guarantees around it that, it's not just run by people who are stealing for themselves. We need to have protection for consumers, and like, we're part of that process. Like, the other thing too is what we produce as tools in blockchain forensics are, they are very good in terms of what we provide as an opportunity. As I said, the comparison is between, a still photograph and, a moving image. Like, we have more context and history about a payment chain than you might get from like a traditional transaction or deposit. There's always potential for abuse there. But we are, I'm trying to say, like, we add value in this regard, but also at the same time, we're not the be all and end all as a thing. Like, you still need to have that combined with a robust, KYC framework. You still need to know who your customers are. You still need to check their identities and make sure, they're not on a sanctioned list, or they've not been, they're not criminals, or they're not using fake identities or whatever else to sign up to your platform. Like, we're just part of a bigger jigsaw puzzle to protect companies. And then, the idea too is risk is not a binary thing. It's multispectral, right? We have graduations of risk. And even if you have robust controls in place, you're not going to stop everybody.
Right. Yeah. I did a presentation a while back, and I was showing what a bank robber looked like in 1850 and what 1900 and 1950 and 2000. And then you try to ratchet ahead, what is a bank robber going to look like in 2050? And that's where I used a picture of a guy with his watch stealing from a bank with his watch.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
We don't even know what that's going to look like at this point. So you had talked a little bit about this, but what were some of the false assumptions that Bitcoin and some of the early cryptocurrencies were founded on? I mean, this was a libertarian quant mindset. These are very smart guys that were determined to change the world, and they didn't quite have all of the kind of the pieces of the blocks in place to make good sense out of it.
I agree. I think the first point is that it was founded on the principle, like in the infamous Bitcoin white paper that, I think has sort of like defined lots of theological discussions later about like what is money and what's this. Like, the whole principle is that they wanted a more fair financial system that wasn't under a group of politicians who they rejected as being competent. And I guess that's like the ethos to begin with. Is like there was a rejection of politicians' competency, and the proposition was, well, we can do better because we're smart guys. I think some of the early assumptions around the technology was that because it didn't live in the same space as traditional financial systems, that it was immune from any form of oversight. It was anonymous because it didn't have a physical name attached to anything, because it was peer-to-peer. I didn't need to identify the name of my counterparty. I could just send it like a cash transaction, right? So just like handing money to the next guy and so on and so forth. And I kind of get the impression that's what the early days of Bitcoin were about, is like, I don't really need to know the other person. I can just send them the money and that's it, done, dusted. And I can hold my money myself, and there's no one's going to get involved in it. It's clear. I mean, the issue then becomes is, if you exist only inside that system, it's anonymity is entirely possible, right? Because if you don't require access to any other currency, there's no requirement for an exchange, particularly into like a fiat currency like a dollar or a euro or a pound. There's no requirement for you to divulge who you are to anyone. You just continue on the network, and that's you good to go. The threshold is that when you do want to, or you come up to an obstacle where you can't make a payment in that currency, as in like, you can't pay your utility bill in Bitcoin, and you can't pay, your mortgage in Bitcoin, or your Lamborghini rental payment or whatever else you've got, you need to change it from one to another. And that interface is where we start introducing your customer and the regulated exchanges. And now that's where the kind of like the privacy barrier dies, because now we have to identify ourselves to somebody. And from that start point, just as we talked about with Marat and Biev, we're able to pull the whole history and say, okay, well, where did this money come from? And now we can see, right? We can see that, all this money has come from these various places, and we can see like what your history is. So I don't think the founders envisaged a system where there would be, or considered potentially the need to purchase things still in two currencies at the same time. It's a very good complete system. Like, if that's all we use, like, it works fine, perhaps for anonymity or pseudo, I guess, because if you're able to associate at one stage for some reason, you can put everything else. But once you have to cross a membrane to fiat, then you are more identifiable, because there's usually some kind of barrier there.
Yeah. So do you see a time sometime in the future where banks themselves go away, or will they always exist?
No, I think banks are always going to exist. Because like a bank, like, although it's kind of like anti, like the ethos of cryptocurrency to a certain extent is banks do a lot more than just hold your money. Like they lend money to business projects. They lend money to individuals to buy houses. They do lots of management of things. There's lots of other activities that banks conduct that don't just involve the transactions that cryptocurrency tends to. And there's lots of exciting stuff in cryptocurrency. I kind of think that the bank will never disappear. I think that it will be augmented. It's a bit like AI, right? It's like, will AI replace us? People say, like, is there a time in space where if I'm a copywriter, I don't have a job anymore because just, someone uses Bard or ChatGPT or, something similar. And I kind of get the idea that the future is more about augmenting existing processes with more effective technologies, right? So it's not about replacing us. It's about, making a cyborg, right? I guess if that's the right way of describing it, like, it's augmenting the existing systems with better technology. And I think that's what really excites me about it. Like, there's lots of games, like a lot of the cryptocurrency sort of space or crypto asset space looks very, immature, and like it's gamified to a certain extent. guys look at, investment projects the same way as they're buying, in-game currency for Fortnite or whatever else in secondary markets. But what's exciting for me is that the plumbing underneath it, the creativity of those who are developing services, the way in which things are being structured and can be done in a more in a trustless environment, like can operate in a more automated way. It's really, really interesting to see it happens. And I kind of, again, I don't think it'll replace the existing financial system. I don't think we're going to do away with interest-bearing loans or investment funds or whatever else. Like, that's not going to disappear. I think it's going to be augmented by the technology itself, and I think that's what's exciting. And I'll be completely clear. Like, I was for a very long time somewhat of a non-believer in crypto assets. I think when I first heard about Bitcoin was 2011, and I think the price of Bitcoin then was going like fairly quickly up from a couple of $100 to like $1,000, and we were all discussing about whether to invest it. And I thought, oh, this is nonsense. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is, who's gonna? And again, the point was like, what can you spend it on? Like, it only exists in a market where someone wants it, right? So I thought it was either nonsense. And then fast forward a few years later, and I started to think, okay, well, an uncomfortable fact about innovation, and particularly for for financial products, is that like the grayer and perhaps illicit areas of the world tend to lead innovation in these spaces because they've got a bigger problem to solve, right? And the more I looked at it, the more I was like, actually, the innovation of this product is like, it's been abused clearly, but actually they're solving problems which a lot of people can relate to, right? And that kind of makes me think this is why I'll have a closer look at the technology. And then when I realized, this difference between a still statement, oh, I've got these following inputs. Okay, I can see that the money was received from this place. Okay, but who paid them? Like, where did they get their money from? Like, what's the whole network of things? And that might be interesting to me. Like, if I'm an employee at a company and they pay me in cryptocurrency, maybe I'm interested to see like which exchanges they have a relationship with. Like, maybe if I'm a bit concerned about what's going on, I can look at my payment and maybe I can discover, okay, well, it came from this place. That makes sense. That doesn't make sense. I think also if I'm a bank looking at my client and my client turns up to me with, $2 million in Bitcoin and says, oh, I'd like to convert it into fiat so I can buy property. Okay, well, now I can really tell the provenance of the funds. Like, writing it came from investments or a trust or something else, I actually have some context of where the money came from. And that was really my eureka moment. It's like, actually, this is a better way of working. And it does fly in the face of the privacy crowd. But the reality is that I want a better system. The UNODC estimates between 2 and 5% of global GDP is from illicit sources. And that goes from, fairly major crimes like terrorism, to things that are like, tax evasion or fraud or whatever else. It's hugely problematic. And like, one of the big things about money laundering generally is like, it robs society. So like, like 2 to 5% of global GDP, which is a ton of money, doesn't get collected in tax revenue, right? Okay, well, what's the point then? Well, if it doesn't get collected in tax revenue, that's a teacher who doesn't get a pay rise. That's a school that doesn't get built. It's a hospital that doesn't get, maintained. It's a road that doesn't get repaved. It's an investment in an industry that needs to take off that doesn't happen. And we could, certainly even from the political side, there are lots of arguments say, well, they spend too much on this or they don't spend enough on that. Or like, we can certainly get into like, the political debate. But the reality is that the money that should have been received by the government, which is there to benefit society as a whole, doesn't get received. If it's a fraud payment, Like I've paid my pension money to some fraud guy who's just going to run off with my cash and, be done forever. I've now haven't got that resource to look after me into old age. Like, it's a crime that hurts everybody. And I think because it's seen as a white collar crime, generally people are a bit, the optics around it aren't particularly nasty. So it's money laundering, it just happens. But the reality is it's particularly heinous.
Right.
And I feel like tools like ours and open blockchains generally, if we can take a dent out of that, if we can make it more difficult for the people who are trying to, steal from everyone basically to enrich themselves, then that's a good thing. Like I feel like that's something that we could all probably agree on. Although, just to sort of like counter that entirely, security is always a balance, right? And it's kind of a difficult one to try and get right. Where do you draw the line between privacy, individual freedom, and security? And there are many different opinions on that, I know.
Are you enjoying this episode of the Futurati Podcast? If so, please like it, give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. By far, the best way to help us grow is to spread the word on social media, which will expose our content to more people and help us continue to bring you interviews with world-leading experts in AI, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and so much more. Thank you in advance.
Right. I always think of this as this trilemma between convenience and security and privacy. They're all pulling in different directions, and it's a balancing act to get it all optimized, but you'll never get it perfect. And so now so the people that worked on the early forms of cryptocurrency were intrigued by all the notions that we can do things better than things were done in the past. We can make transactions happen much faster, quicker, better, and fairer than ever before. And so that thinking still permeates most of the crypto world. What are some of the things that this has opened the door for? What are some of the emerging technologies that you think will be coming down the pike in the next 10, 15 years in the crypto space that will kind of unleash new capabilities, new ways of doing things? I know Japan has just announced that they would like to be able to allow startup companies to issue cryptocurrency rather than stocks as a way of funding the startups. That has great potential, but it also has great risks at the same time. So what kind of things are going through your mind?
So I think the key thing that I get is just that tokenization. And I think that's really the big opportunity with it, is that rather than rely on centralized databases, it's blockchain's a distributed database. Let's say what it is. Like, it's not, like it's a very clever implementation, but it's not, it's still a way of recording information. And I think that's like the key point there. I think for me, tokenization is really interesting. I think then organizing that alongside smart contracts, so having the ability to program a series of actions based on certain predetermined conditions, and doing that without having to rely on some kind of intervention is very, very exciting. Like, it's very, very interesting to think that, that an insurance payout can be done, it can be released in a much more, streamlined manner. I think the idea too that, you don't, like, for tokenization, you can see the distribution of tokens across a broader group of people. I think also the fact that there are less, like maybe potentially less gatekeepers to accessing like more advanced financial services and products. So like, there has been a growth in, online trading platforms, like eToro or, gosh, eToro is the one, Robinhood, the ones that sort of stood out to me. I think crypto offers like another way to try and, increase that kind of opportunity and access through, a more open system. Like the barrier to entry isn't as, going through a broker anymore. It's very much, do you have access to the contract to release a token to you, and you got to pay the money to do it. And I think that's a lot nicer. I think that's what's going to be, if we're looking at like the future of the system in the next 15 years or so, tokenization, that's what it's going to be. I think, I think just to sort of like add on to that, tokenization is an interesting one because they're probably like talk about NFTs, like non-fungible tokens, and aside from the artwork, which is divisive, as one use case, there is some interesting, things you can do with an NFT. What if your property deeds were an NFT, right? And what if your vehicle service contract or registration was an NFT?
We have a friend that's actually working on some dynamic NFTs for houses, and so anytime there's a repair or some payment or some improvement done to the property, that all gets recorded in it. So then the next time you want to sell the house, then you have that active record of all of the changes that have happened in that real property then. So I think there's lots of opportunity there that we're just kind of scratching the surface of what's possible and what isn't at the moment. Well, this is absolutely fascinating. What are some of the things that your company is doing in Ukraine right now? Because you have a large part of your company is dealing with some of the payments going over to the Ukraine.
Yeah. So in terms of that, so we have some staff members who are Ukrainian and still reside within Kyiv. They're still quite active and working pretty hard, and genuinely impressed by their determination to keep going despite everything that's going on around them. In terms of other stuff, we do look at donations into the Ukrainian government and the military charities. So we keep track of that in a regular report. So the donations there. But we also look at the other side too and see, where money's come from that's been sent to support, Russian military organizations too, and see, where the funds may have originated from or where they're being dispersed to. And again, it's quite an interesting comparison. I think one of the big points in this particular conflict is it's kind of like, it's the war that crypto assets are kind of center stage to a certain extent, right? There's lots of discussion about, receiving donations in Bitcoin or Tether or whatever else, to either side of the parties. Are the Russian government going to use crypto assets to circumvent international sanctions? Are they going to establish the Russian citizens and Ukrainian citizens who are now under capital controls or limited because of non-inclusion in their financial system? Are they going to turn to crypto assets to try and find a way around it? So we try and understand as much as possible that's going on there. We do look at a lot of the anecdotal evidence. So, one of the things that happened at the outset of the war was, a lot of Russian cryptocurrency users were concerned that their accounts would be frozen on European or American exchanges. So, not Russian expats, but Russians in Russia who had accounts on, major exchanges, like, oh, I'm going to have my account frozen, or what should I do? And there were quite a lot of discussions amongst individual participants about, okay, well, where can we take our money? Like, where can we put our cryptocurrency and continue to trade and exchange? And that's quite interesting sort of from our side to see, okay, that's what they're discussing. Like, can we then go and find on-chain correlative information that shows that behavior shift has taken place, right? That they've done that. One of the big problems, I guess, too, is it's really hard to geolocate a cryptocurrency transaction. Like, there are some soft indicators. You could look at web traffic. You can look at, in some cases, IP addresses are leaked by Bitcoin nodes, which might give us an idea where the transaction was picked up from by a node. But really, you can't tell, right? And it's not, the person who would know is the exchange provider who sees the transaction or the client connecting to their website and working. And that's forgetting about like VPNs or, stolen credential browsers, that kind of stuff. Like, we'll forget about it. So,
well, one thing that's different in the Ukraine war is that we decided to somehow go after the wealthy people, the oligarchs in Russia. And it's a kind of guilt by association, even though they probably have nothing personally invested in conducting this war on either side. But yet their assets are being seized, and they're so they then become kind of a whole nother type of warfare going on in the background. So do you see this type of warfare against the wealthy class people moving forward? Is this something that we're going to see much more of in the future?
So like, like I'll look at it this way. The people who become sanctions targets are assessed to have, and now thinking about an intelligence perspective, assessed to have some level of control or influence over policymakers, that by excluding them or confiscating their assets or freezing their assets, that they will then be able to, have some kind of leverage over the policymakers. From my perspective, one of the assumptions that this is founded upon is that by doing so, these people will have leverage over the autocrat, right? And it's not just, like the Russian government, but you could look at the Iranian government, you could look at other places. Like in autocratic regimes, like, you kind of have to toe the line whatever happens, and we know what happens to you if you don't. Do you know what I mean? Like, you probably want to stay away from your windows or staircases, if you're a Russian oligarch and you suddenly have a couple of crosswords about what the policy is at the moment on the conflict in Ukraine. Like, if they were to speak out against them, like the reciprocation from the government or the policymakers is going to be pretty sharp, and they know that. So is it an effective method? I think in some ways it does, show to be doing something from, the policymakers of sanctions. But on the other side is like, has it changed anything? You can, like, we'll talk about Iran, for example, that sanctions have been really effective in slowing down the Iranian government's pursuit of a nuclear weapons program, but it didn't stop it. Like, it slowed it down. And the idea is like, you can trade relief in sanctions for other things. Like, we had 5 Americans day before, who were released from Iranian custody in exchange for, the loosening of sanctions. So from my side, it's, do we see this being more done? I think one of the bigger issues you have, and it's because, the reserve currency of the world is the dollar, the more that this approach of sanctioning gets pushed out, the more pushback there is against, the US dollar's hegemony. Like, it's kind of a dual edge weapon. Like, on one side, you've got, we can control, we can slow things down, we can make it difficult. But on the other hand, what we're doing is we're risking alienating allies by, and devaluing, the hard power of our money, because people are like, well, now I've got so many alternatives, or I'll seek alternatives. As we're seeing with BRICS, for example, right. People will try and find a way around it. And I think, again, the guys who work in the US Treasury and OFAC and all the other sanction bodies, like, they're clever guys, like, they know what they're doing. But at the same time, it's not a magic bullet, right? You can sanction someone, but you also need to be prepared to, find another way around it. And, to one of a better phrase too, is that all the sanctions that are levied against these high value targets, the wealthy targets in these countries that, are, policy opposed to Western states, they still find a way around it, right? They still have access to lots of money. They still are able to take holidays. There are still ways around it and abuse the traditional financial system fairly comfortably. And I think that's the other part of this is that not everyone's on the same page in terms of dealing with this.
Well, yeah, in some ways it opens the doors for new type of warfare, putting together a list of who the largest campaign donors are, or key heads of key agencies like the Federal Reserve Bank or the Treasury Department or something in various countries. So those become targets rather than fighting with ground troops trying to take this city or that city. It seems like we could have a war that's much more precise and go after individuals. And probably even as Elon Musk has hinted to, that when you can fire a laser from space and take out an individual, that totally changes the game of war.
Yeah. There's a really interesting book that was written a while ago called The Wizards of Armageddon, and it talks about the early days of the Rand Corporation and some of the discussions they had, and so they were talking about like the early days of nuclear policy, and I shall not try to do it because I'm not an arms control expert or professor or anything like that at all. But one of the big things they talked about was what you're suggesting is decapitation operations, right? So like, the US has a very capable military and intelligence agency. They can probably get somebody inside any country they like to, off anybody they want. Like, why haven't they just, do you go and do this? And part of this sort of path back to Wizards of Armageddon, and I encourage people to read about it because it's a fascinating book. But one of the things they discuss is like, well, if you do kill the leadership, then who's left to negotiate with you? Like, who do you negotiate a surrender with? I think also, I have a fairly bit of experience in counterterrorism. I think sometimes people overestimate leadership figures' ability to enact change.
Right.
Like, it's deeper than that. I think, take for example, the raids against Osama bin Laden or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Iraq or whatever else. Like, the US Special Forces, in combination and support of their allies, were able to, destroy the leadership of some pretty major terrorist organizations, but yet still they remain. Why is that? Because it's more than just, it's more than just that. Like, you can't just like kill the guy and then it's the game's over. Like, it's not at the boss level on Doom. Like, you've got to deconstruct the whole apparatus. And from my side, there's a lot of stick, right? When you talk about these things, like, let's talk about sanctions, for example. There's a lot of stick to these guys, which is,
right,
we're going to put sanctions list. All right, where's the carrot? Where's the opportunity to be part of a solution? Like, okay, right, we don't like you doing this. Here's what you can do, and like, come back to the table with a better offer. And I think also, successively there has been erosions in diplomacy, like, as in like investing is an art form, which it is. Like, it's very much no, we do it my way, and I think that kind of approach is really running out of steam.
Right.
Do you need a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker for an event? Thomas Fry and me, Trent Fowler, are both seasoned keynote speakers, able to converse on a wide array of topics to audiences of all sizes and skill levels. Go to the contact page at futuraudiopodcast.com to book Thomas or myself today and let us apply our years of experience in public speaking to make your event a smashing success.
So I think there's a lot of false assumptions around if you just stop a war, that peace will break out. It doesn't happen that way.
Yeah, exactly.
The opposite of war is not peace. It's strange how we make a lot of false assumptions there. But we're coming up on our time here, and I was going to ask if you could give us some of the ways that people could contact you, and if they're interested in following up on some of the things that your company offers.
Absolutely. So I have social media. I'm on LinkedIn. Nick Smart, the ironically named Director of Intelligence for Crystal Blockchain. Our website for our company is crystalblockchain.com. Just chuck it into your browser, you'll find us. There are email links on there. People can email us our contact page directly, or again, feel free to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn if they have any specific questions. For those who have like a bent on foreign policy or like particularly strong opinions on sanctions, I've done my best. Like, some of the views are my own rather than expressed to the company's behalf, I would suggest, on foreign policy matters. But it's very much something I'm happy to discuss about. And I do feel quite passionately about it. I think, I would, as we talked about with cryptocurrency, and something the message of this is there must be a better way. And I kind of want there to be a better way for all these things.
Right. Well, very good. I really appreciate all the insights you've given us here, and some very thoughtful responses to some pretty tricky questions I've been asking you. All right. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate you spending time with us today.
Thanks very much.